Grayson Pierce slammed his tumbler of whiskey down on the bar, a slow grin spreading across his face as he leaned back in his seat. "You're bluffing," he said smoothly, arms crossed as he eyed his longtime friend and business rival, Mason Holt. Mason smirked, flipping over his cards with a satisfied chuckle. "Think again, Pierce." Grayson's confidence shattered as he stared at the losing hand before him. He had never lost a bet, not in business, not in poker, and certainly not to Mason. But there it was, undeniable proof that luck had abandoned him tonight. Mason leaned forward, his grin widening. "And you remember the stakes, don't you?" Grayson ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling. Yeah, I remember." "You, Grayson Pierce, multimillionaire CEO of Pierce Innovations, will spend the next 4 weeks working at Mel's Diner apron, name tag and all." Mason's amusement was clear. "No special treatment, no telling anyone who you really are, just a regular guy flipping burgers and pouring coffee." Grayson scoffed, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous." "A bet's a bet," Mason reminded him, clapping him on the back. "Besides, it'll be good for you. You might even learn a thing or two about real life." Grayson rolled his eyes. He had built his empire from the ground up, made his first million at 22, and now, at 28, he was one of the most powerful men in the industry. He didn't need a lesson in real life. But a bet was a bet. The next morning, Grayson stood in front of Mel's Diner, staring at the faded red sign swinging above the door. The place was small, the kind of classic American diner that smelled like fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. He had driven past it dozens of times, but had never once thought to step inside. Now, here he was dressed in a plain black t-shirt and jeans, no designer suits, no luxury watches, stripped of everything that made him who he was. He sighed and pushed the door open. Behind the counter, a woman was refilling a customer's coffee, her back turned to him. "Sit anywhere you'd like," she called over her shoulder. Grayson's eyes flickered to her. She was petite but fierce, her auburn hair tied in a messy bun, a few strands falling around her face. She moved quickly, balancing plates with impressive ease, a natural confidence in her every motion. Then she turned around, and for the first time in years, Grayson felt like someone had knocked the breath out of him. She was beautiful. Not in the polished, calculated way women in his world were draped in designer dresses and expensive perfume, but in a way that felt real. Freckles dusted across her nose, and her hazel eyes held a spark of something he couldn't quite place. She arched a brow. "Are you gonna stare at me all day, or do you need a menu?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard by her bluntness. Women usually fawned over him, but this one? She looked ready to toss him out if he didn't answer fast enough. I'm actually here to start work," he said, clearing his throat, her eyes narrowed. "You're the new guy, unfortunately." She studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Well, come on, rich boy, you've got a lot to learn." Grayson stiffened. "What makes you think I'm rich?" she smirked. "Your hands are too smooth." "You've never worked a day of physical labor in your life, have you?" Grayson clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to admit she was right. "I'm Lucy, by the way," she said, tossing him an apron. "Try to keep up." Grayson quickly learned that working at a diner was nothing like running a multimillion-dollar company. Within his first 3 hours, he had burned his forearm on the grill, spilled a milkshake on himself, and nearly dropped an entire plate of pancakes on the floor. Lucy found it all hilarious. "You're a disaster," she teased, leaning against the counter as he struggled to work the cash register. Grayson shot her a glare. "I run one of the most successful tech companies in the country." "I think I can handle a diner." Lucy raised a brow. "Oh, and what's your company called?" His lips parted, but he caught himself just in time. He couldn't tell her. That was part of the deal. "It's, a small startup, nothing major," he said quickly. Lucy snorted. "Sure it is." Grayson hated how much she amused herself at his expense. But at the same time, he couldn't deny how different she was from the women he usually met. She didn't care about impressing him. She didn't bat her lashes, didn't try to charm him. If anything, she seemed to enjoy putting him in his place, and for some reason, that intrigued him. By the end of his shift, Grayson was exhausted. His muscles ached, his feet felt like they were on fire, and he had newfound respect for anyone who did this for a living. Lucy handed him a glass of water as they both collapsed into a booth. "Not bad for your first day, rich boy," Grayson rolled his eyes. "Would you stop calling me that?" she smirked. "I'll stop when you stop looking like you belong in a boardroom instead of behind a grill," he chuckled, shaking his head. "You're something else, you know that," Lucy shrugged. "I just call it like I see it." Grayson studied her, taking in the way she sipped her water, the way she seemed so at ease in this world. He had everything: money, power, success. But for the first time in a long time, sitting across from this woman in a tiny diner, he wondered if maybe he had been missing something all along. Grayson didn't know how he dragged himself back to Mel's the next morning. Every muscle in his body protested after yesterday's shift, a stark reminder that no amount of boardroom strategizing could prepare him for the relentless pace of the diner. He had faced corporate takeovers with more confidence than he had flipping pancakes. Lucy barely spared him a glance when he walked in, tossing him a notepad without a word. He caught it midair, his reflexes at least somewhat intact. Customers filled the booths, the scent of coffee thick in the air. He hadn't realized how chaotic mornings could be until he found himself in the middle of the rush. Orders were barked at him from every direction, the kitchen clanged with activity, and Lucy wove through it all with an effortless rhythm. Grayson, on the other hand, was drowning. By the time he managed to scribble down an order correctly, Lucy had already delivered 3 plates and refilled 5 coffee cups. His frustration mounted when a customer waved him over, rattling off a complicated omelet request. He nodded, pretending to understand before rushing to the kitchen. He barely pushed through the swinging doors when Lucy appeared beside him, arms crossed. "That guy at table 6, she said, eyebrow raised. "You just told the cook he wanted extra onions." "He actually said no onions," Grayson groaned, rubbing his temples. "I don't know how you process all this so fast," she smirked. "It's called paying attention." He shot her a look, but she was already moving past him, correcting his mistake before he could say another word. The second half of the shift wasn't any easier. He nearly upended a tray of drinks, got scolded by the cook for standing in the wrong spot, and endured several unimpressed glances from customers who clearly preferred Lucy's service over his. Yet, despite the disaster that was his performance, there was something oddly satisfying about the work. It was different, real, and Lucy, she was impossible to ignore. Later that evening, when the last customer had left and the chairs were flipped onto tables, Grayson found himself leaning against the counter, watching Lucy count her tips. She didn't notice him at first, her fingers moving swiftly over the worn bills. "Do you ever slow down?" he asked. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Not if I want to survive." It wasn't the answer he expected. He had assumed she worked here because she liked it, not because she had to. But something about her tone made him wonder how much of her confidence was a shield. "You live around here?" he asked, testing the waters. She hesitated before answering. "A few blocks away, it's nothing fancy, but it's home." Grayson nodded, sensing there was more to her story than she was willing to share. He could tell by the way she avoided his gaze, the way her fingers tightened slightly around the money in her hands. "You ask a lot of questions," she said, changing the subject. "Maybe I'm trying to figure you out." She huffed a laugh. "Good luck with that, rich boy," he frowned. "You really have to stop calling me that." "I'll consider it," she teased, slipping the cash into her apron before heading toward the back. Grayson watched her go, a strange feeling settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about work or business deals or numbers on a spreadsheet. He was thinking about Lucy. Grayson adjusted his grip on the heavy crate of fresh produce as he stepped into the back room of the diner, his arms burning from the unexpected effort. He had spent years negotiating multimillion-dollar deals, yet somehow, carrying a box of tomatoes felt like a bigger challenge. The satisfaction Lucy got from seeing him struggle was evident in the corner of her smirk, as she wiped down the counter. "You're getting better," she mused, eyeing the way he carefully set the crate down as if expecting to drop it at any second. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "You say that like I was completely hopeless before." She tilted her head, feigning deep thought. "I mean, you did nearly set a napkin dispenser on fire yesterday." Grayson scowled. "That was one time." Lucy grinned, her amusement barely concealed, and yet it was enough to be memorable. Grayson didn't bother arguing, she had a point. He had never met someone who challenged him so effortlessly, who treated him without the reverence he was used to. There was no pretense with her, just honesty, humor, and a sharp wit that kept him on his toes. As he wiped his hands on a towel, the sound of an approaching voice made them both turn. Mel, the diner's owner, stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning the space before settling on Grayson. "Pierce," she said, arms crossed, "you up for a little extra responsibility today?" Grayson straightened, trying to ignore the way Lucy was watching him with clear curiosity. "Sure, what do you need?" Mel tossed him a set of keys. "You're closing up with Lucy tonight." "Think you can handle that?" Grayson caught the keys midair, nodding. "Yeah, I can handle it." Lucy's eyebrows lifted slightly, clearly surprised. "Guess we'll see about that." The evening rush had been brutal, but by the time the last customer left, the diner was finally quiet. Grayson stretched his sore arms as Lucy locked the door, the small chime of the bell above it marking the official end of their shift. "Not bad," she admitted, tossing a cleaning rag onto the counter. "You only messed up 2 orders today," Grayson groaned. "You're keeping count now," she shrugged, a faint smirk on her lips. "It's an easy number to remember." He huffed a laugh, leaning against the counter as she gathered the day's earnings. Despite how exhausting the job was, there was something oddly satisfying about finishing a shift. The kind of tired he felt wasn't the usual stress-induced exhaustion from endless meetings and high-stakes decisions. It was physical, real. Lucy didn't rush as she counted the cash, her fingers moving deftly over the bills. Grayson found himself watching her, noting the quiet focus in her expression. "You always close?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Most nights," she replied without looking up. "Mel trusts me with it." He nodded, absorbing the weight of her words. Trust. It was something he didn't give or receive easily in his world. Everyone had an agenda, an angle, but Lucy, she seemed to do things simply because they needed to be done. She finished counting, securing the cash in a deposit bag before glancing up at him. "You ready to lock up?" Grayson nodded, following her lead as she switched off the lights. The diner felt different in the dim glow of the streetlights outside, quieter, more intimate. As they stepped out onto the sidewalk, Lucy turned to lock the door, her fingers moving with practiced ease. "You walk home?" he asked, shoving his hands into his pockets. She glanced at him, eyes flickering with mild suspicion. "Yeah, why?" he hesitated. "I'll walk with you." She seemed to consider it for a moment before shrugging. "Suit yourself." They fell into step together, the night air cool against his skin. The streets were quiet, the hum of distant traffic the only real sound between them. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said after a while, side-eyeing him. "I know," he replied simply. Lucy let out a small breath, as if she wasn't used to people offering something without expecting anything in return. After a few minutes, she stopped in front of a modest apartment building. "This is me." Grayson looked up at the structure, taking in the peeling paint and flickering hallway light beyond the entrance. It wasn't much, but it was clear it was hers. "Thanks for the walk, rich boy," she said, the nickname laced with amusement. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Good night, Lucy." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Good night, Grayson." As she disappeared into the building, he lingered for a moment, staring at the door she had just walked through. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about work, finances, or the next deal. He was thinking about her. Grayson had never been the kind of man to lose focus. In business, he calculated every move with precision, never allowing distractions to cloud his judgment. But Lucy, she had become the one thing he couldn't ignore. Days at the diner passed in a blur of clattering dishes, rushed orders, and stolen glances. The work was still exhausting, but he no longer cared. Every interaction with her left him wanting more of her laughter, more of her teasing, more of the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Something had shifted between them, an unspoken understanding that neither acknowledged but both felt. She had stopped calling him rich boy quite so often, and he found himself lingering after his shifts just to be near her. One night, as they locked up, a light rain began to fall, misting the pavement beneath their feet. Lucy tilted her head toward the sky, closing her eyes for a brief moment before shaking the droplets from her hair. "You ever just stand in the rain?" she asked, voice softer than usual. Grayson watched her, taking in the way the streetlights reflected in her damp lashes. "Not on purpose," he admitted. She gave a small, knowing smile. "Figures." Without thinking, he reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. Her breath hitched, just barely, but she didn't pull away. His fingers lingered for a second longer than necessary before he dropped his hand. For the first time since he met her, Lucy looked uncertain, vulnerable. "Grayson," she started, her voice quieter now. He waited, heart pounding, but whatever she had been about to say never came. Instead, she swallowed and stepped back, shoving her hands into her jacket pockets. "You should get home," she said, voice back to its usual guarded tone. He nodded, knowing she was pulling away but unsure how to stop it. That night he barely slept. The next afternoon, Grayson arrived at the diner to find Lucy already there, standing behind the counter with a faraway look in her eyes. She didn't acknowledge him right away, her fingers idly tapping against the countertop. "You okay?" he asked, leaning against the edge of the register. She blinked, as if shaking herself out of a trance before offering a half-hearted smile. "Yeah, just thinking." He didn't believe her. Before he could press further, the bell above the door jingled, and a man in a suit stepped inside. Grayson recognized the type immediately, polished, confident, the kind of guy who thought the world bent to his will. Lucy tensed the moment she saw him. "Lucy," the man said, striding toward the counter, "you've been ignoring my calls." Grayson didn't like the way he spoke to her, like she owed him something. Lucy crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "That's because I don't have anything to say to you, Adam." Adam. The name alone made Grayson's jaw tighten. "You can't keep avoiding this," Adam continued, unfazed. "You know as well as I do that." "I don't care what you think you know," Lucy cut in, her voice firm. "There's nothing left to talk about." Grayson stepped closer, instinctively placing himself between them. "Is there a problem here?" Adam turned his gaze on him for the first time, clearly sizing him up. "And who are you?" "None of your business," Grayson shot back. Adam scoffed. "Right, just another one of Lucy's lost causes, I see." Grayson didn't know what that meant, but he knew he didn't like it. Lucy exhaled sharply. "You need to leave, Adam." Adam looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment, he shook his head in disgust and turned for the door. "This isn't over," he warned before stepping outside. Grayson watched him go, then turned to Lucy. "Who was that?" She hesitated, then sighed. "No one that matters anymore." He didn't push, even though he wanted to. But later that night, as he walked her home again, she finally spoke. Adam and I used to be engaged, she admitted, her voice steady but distant. It ended badly. Grayson clenched his fists. He doesn't seem to understand that it's over, Lucy shrugged. He never liked losing. Something about the way she said it made Grayson's stomach turn. Did he? No, she interjected, shaking her head. Not in the way you're thinking, but he made me feel like I wasn't enough. Like I had to prove something to him. Grayson's chest tightened. The idea of anyone making Lucy feel unworthy was infuriating. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, he said, his voice low, firm. She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time there was no teasing, no walls. Just raw honesty? Neither do you, she whispered. The words hit deeper than he expected. They stood there, inches apart, the rain from the night before still clinging to the air. He didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was her, but suddenly, she was in his arms, her hands gripping his jacket as his lips crashed against hers. It wasn't slow or tentative, it was desperate, urgent, like they had both been waiting for this moment to break the tension that had been building between them since the day they met. When they finally pulled apart, Lucy was breathless, her eyes searching his. I don't know what this is, she admitted. Neither do I, he replied honestly, but I know I don't want to stop. She exhaled, then nodded as if accepting something she had been fighting for too long. Then don't, she murmured, and just like that, nothing else mattered. Grayson had never been one to second-guess himself, but now, standing outside Lucy's apartment for the third time in a week, he hesitated. Their kiss had changed everything. He had never felt anything so raw, so consuming. But with it came a new complication, the undeniable truth that he wasn't just some guy working at a diner. He was Grayson Pierce, multimillionaire, and he had been lying to her since the moment they met. Lucy had trusted him, let him in, and when she found out the truth, would she ever forgive him? The door in front of him swung open before he could knock. Lucy stood there, her auburn hair slightly tousled, wearing an oversized sweater that swallowed her frame. She blinked in surprise, then leaned against the doorframe, arms crossing in that way that made it impossible to read her. You planning on standing out here all night? She asked. Grayson exhaled, offering a small smile. Didn't want to assume I was welcome. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. That was enough. The small living room carried the scent of coffee and something vaguely sweet, as if she'd been baking. A mismatched collection of books lined a shelf, and a well-worn couch sat in the center of the room. It was lived in, comfortable, everything his penthouse wasn't. Lucy moved to the kitchen, grabbing 2 mugs from the cabinet. You look like you have something on your mind, he did, but he couldn't tell her, not yet. Instead, he leaned against the counter, fingers drumming lightly. Just thinking about how different this is from what I'm used to. Lucy quirked a brow. What, the lack of chaos? Or the fact that you aren't spilling coffee on yourself every 5 minutes? He chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe both. She handed him a mug, curling into the corner of the couch as he took a seat beside her. For a while, they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, though it was charged, filled with something unspoken. Eventually, Lucy sighed, turning to face him fully. I don't do this, you know. Grayson frowned slightly. Do what? Let people in, she admitted, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. I don't trust easily, he knew that. He had felt it in every guarded look, every moment she hesitated before letting him see the real her. I don't either, he said, voice quiet. She gave him a look, one that said she knew he was holding something back, but instead of pushing, she nodded. Guess that makes 2 of us, she murmured. The weight in his chest deepened. Because soon she would know, and when she did, would she still look at him like this? Would she still let him in? The next morning at the diner, Grayson had barely tied his apron when Mel pulled him aside, her sharp eyes scanning him like she knew something was off. You look like a man with a problem, she said, arms crossed. Grayson hesitated. He wasn't in the habit of talking about his personal life, especially not with someone he barely knew. But Mel had a way of seeing straight through people, and he wasn't sure he could dodge her scrutiny. Let's just say I'm in unfamiliar territory, he admitted. Mel gave a knowing nod. Let me guess, it has to do with Lucy, he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, Mel leaned against the counter, studying him. That girl's been through enough. If you're gonna hurt her, walk away now, Grayson stiffened. I don't want to hurt her. Then be honest with her, Mel said simply, before it's too late. The words hit harder than he expected. He had to tell Lucy the truth. That night, after closing, Grayson found himself standing outside Lucy's apartment again. This time, his heart pounded for a different reason. When she opened the door, she immediately frowned. What's wrong? Grayson exhaled, stepping inside, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. There's something I need to tell you. Lucy's brow furrowed. Okay, he swallowed hard. I haven't been completely honest with you, she stiffened. He could see the walls coming up, her defenses locking into place. I'm not just some guy who lost a bet, he said, forcing the words out before he could stop himself. I'm Grayson Pierce. Lucy blinked, confusion flickering across her face. The Grayson Pierce. As in, the multimillionaire, he nodded. For a moment she just stared at him, then she took a step back, crossing her arms tightly. You lied to me. It wasn't supposed to be a lie, he said quickly. It started as a bet, but then I met you and I didn't know how to tell you, her expression hardened. So what was this? Some rich guy's experiment, slumming it for a month before going back to your perfect life. Grayson's chest ached at the accusation. No, Lucy, that's not what this is. She shook her head, turning away from him. I let you in, she whispered. I trusted you. Lucy, please, he said, stepping closer. I didn't plan for this to happen, but it did, and it's real. She didn't answer right away. When she finally turned back to him, her eyes were filled with something he couldn't name. I need time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Grayson's stomach dropped, but he nodded. Take all the time you need. And with that, he walked away, hoping, praying that she would find a way to forgive him. Grayson had never been one to wait. In business, hesitation was weakness. Yet here he was, pacing the length of his penthouse, staring at his phone like it held the answer to everything. Lucy hadn't called. Days had passed since he told her the truth, and the silence was unbearable. He had respected her request for space, but every second without her felt like a mistake. He had never wanted anything the way he wanted her. A sharp knock at his door startled him. When he opened it, Mason stood there, arms crossed, a knowing smirk on his face. Grayson exhaled sharply. If you're here to say I told you so, don't bother. Mason stepped inside, surveying the pristine apartment before shaking his head. I don't need to say it. You already know. Grayson ran a hand down his face. She won't call. Mason leaned against the counter. You lied to her, Pierce. Women don't take kindly to that, especially not one like Lucy. Grayson clenched his jaw. He knew that already. What he didn't know was how to fix it. Mason watched him for a long moment before sighing. What are you going to do about it? Grayson's grip tightened. Whatever it takes. Lucy sat in the diner long after closing, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. She had spent days trying to make sense of it, trying to separate the man she had known from the one he had hidden. But the truth was, they were the same. Grayson had lied, yes. But he had also been the man who walked her home, who made her laugh, who kissed her in the rain like she was the only thing that mattered. She wanted to hate him, but she couldn't. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. You're thinking too much. Mel stood behind the counter, drying a glass, her sharp gaze unwavering. Lucy sighed. What else am I supposed to do? Mel placed the glass down, leaning forward. Ask yourself this: does it change how you feel about him? Lucy swallowed, gripping the edge of the table. It changes everything. Mel shook her head. No, it just changes what you thought you knew. The words settled deep. Lucy had spent so long guarding herself, so long convincing herself that love was a risk not worth taking. But Grayson had slipped through the cracks, and maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to push him away anymore. Grayson didn't bother with subtlety. When he arrived at the diner, he didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open, the late evening quiet making his presence impossible to ignore. Lucy looked up from behind the counter, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, then he stepped forward, his voice steady. "I can't do this without you." She exhaled, setting down the rag she had been holding. "Grayson," he shook his head. "No, let me finish." She hesitated, then nodded. He took another step closer. "I lied to you. I shouldn't have, but everything I felt, everything we were that was real, it still is." Her eyes searched his, doubt flickering beneath the surface. "I know I don't deserve your trust," he continued, his voice quieter now, "but I'm asking for another chance. Not as Grayson Pierce, multimillionaire, just as me." Lucy's breath caught. She wanted to fight it, wanted to hold onto her anger, but the truth was she had already forgiven him. She had just been too scared to admit it. Finally, she stepped around the counter, closing the space between them. "Don't lie to me again," she said, her voice firm but soft. Grayson's chest tightened. "I won't." For a moment, they just stood there. Then, slowly, Lucy reached for him, her fingers curling around his. That was all he needed. He pulled her into his arms, their lips meeting in a kiss that erased every doubt, every hesitation. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in his life, Grayson Pierce knew exactly what he wanted, her. Always.